Turkish officials say a hit squad was sent to kill this Saudi national. Washington Post columnist.
بعد حادثة اختفاء الصحفي السعودي جمال خاشقجي.
لذلك فإن الروايات تتضارب.
Jamal Khashoggi, one of the lone Saudi journalists willing to criticize Saudi leaders. That criticism has apparently left him silenced.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories that we're covering this week. Disappearances can be deceiving. The Khashoggi case, and the news coverage and geopolitics that lie beneath. It looks like news and reads like news, but isn't. It's native advertising. It took a while, but the Me Too movement has finally reached the media in India. And Iran's supreme leader has a theory on why it has stopped short of his country that he's happy to share online. We begin with the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi Arabian journalist in exile who walked into that Saudi consulate in Istanbul last week and never came out. The case is the subject of intense international media speculation, with Turkish officials theorizing Khashoggi was killed inside the consulate and the Saudis insisting that he came and left. And it's produced a level of news coverage seldom afforded Arab dissidents who just disappear. That's because Khashoggi was not just a dissident. He was a former insider-turned-critic of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and he had a platform at his disposal at the Washington Post. His disappearance not only sends a chilling message to independent Saudi voices everywhere, it takes Mohammed bin Salman's well-known intolerance for internal criticism and the House of Saud's utter ambivalence to the disapproval of outsiders to a new level. And it provides yet more evidence of the folly of some in the Western media commentariat who had bought into the image of bin Salman as the enlightened prince, the reformer. Our starting point this week is Istanbul.
Khashoggi entering Saudi Arabia's consulate.
It was a shot seen around the world. Jamal Khashoggi's last moments as a free man. He entered the Istanbul consulate that day having reportedly been assured that he was not being targeted. If it was a trap, then Khashoggi walked right into it.
Jamal Khashoggi would have been a target for a myriad of reasons. Not only was he a longtime insider with many contacts in all spheres of life in Saudi Arabia, he was well acquainted with influential businessmen, with members of the government, bureaucracy, as well as the press. And he was present in a lot of backroom conversations that I'm sure made a lot of people nervous.
He used to appear in BBC, Al Jazeera. He used to be interviewed by, U.S. newspapers, British newspapers. He became like a star in terms of knowledge about Saudi Arabia.
What worrying me the most is one-man rule.
He used to be like even advisor of Prince Turki Al Faisal, who was actually the head of Saudi intelligence, and he was ambassador to the United States. Jamal Khashoggi was like his consultant.
There's different dimensions to this, but they all come together in the fact that the current Saudi government has clamped down really hard on any kind, it's not just dissent, it's any kind of independent opinion that is not completely echoing the government line. They don't like it and they're trying to stop it.
News of Jamal Khashoggi's disappearance was initially greeted with silence from the Saudi Arabian government and the media outlets it controls. The story was being driven from Turkey, but not at the political level. The anonymous sources quoted in the Turkish media, the ones who reportedly described an assassination squad of 15 Saudis landing on 2 private jets that same day, were from Turkish police and intelligence. By day 2, it had grown into a global story, datelined Istanbul, but the Turkish president was saying very little at the time, which is usually not his style.
We have to think of this as well within the context of the media profile of President Erdogan, who is known to speak his mind and to be very passionate when he chooses to push a certain narrative. And he certainly, in his media interviews and interactions, has been very guarded.
Erdogan wants to leave himself room to walk back or to keep himself from the brink when it comes to diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. I don't know if he's trying to hedge himself from going toe-to-toe with MBS over this, at least as of yet. So it seems to me to be a little bit of a political safeguard to allow this to sort of go through secondary channels through law enforcement.
Day 3, and the Saudis issue their first statement, saying that Jamal Khashoggi's disappearance was news to them.
وأكدت القنصلية أنها تقوم بإجراءات المتابعة والتنسيق مع السلطات المحلية التركية.
It wasn't until day 5 that the first real signs of a counter-narrative emerged in the Saudi media space.
إنه هناك نوع من المؤامرة شئنا ما بين على المملكة العربية السعودية.
The state-owned Al Arabiya news channel, backed up by online forces, offered no shortage of possible culprits, none of whom happened to be Saudi.
فالمملكة العربية السعودية احنا نعرف من الأزل أن حسادها كثار وأعدائها كثار.
Among the theories offered, that Qatar, which owns Al Jazeera and is the target of a Saudi-led blockade, was behind the disappearance.
وكشف الدائم لقناة الجزيرة في قطر.
That the Qataris may have had co-conspirators from the Muslim Brotherhood. That Turkey may have been involved.
أن المملكة يجب أن تتهم الحكومة التركية باختفاء خاشقجي.
And that Khashoggi's Turkish fiancé wasn't above suspicion either.
They are associating her with some other Saudi opposition figures, or even Qatari intellectuals and writers. They said, oh, she actually was just an agent of the Turkish state intelligence. And she actually orchestrated all this show to distort the image of Saudi Arabia. It lacks, responsibility, and it lacks logic.
There was a very popular hashtag, مسرحية Jamal Khashoggi, which is translated like the Jamal Khashoggi show, and Twitter users were basically defending the Saudi line and accusing Qatar, accusing Turkey, and the enemies of Saudi Arabia of fabricating the story.
They're not particularly good at it. They're a little bit amateurish, and they keep doing these things, spending millions and millions of dollars on public relations and advertising and propaganda and fake internet stuff. They're not sophisticated in media, they're not sophisticated in foreign policy, and they're not sophisticated in global action. And when you put the three areas together, their lack of sophistication is really quite embarrassing, and we're seeing it played out once more.
Saudi attempts to hijack the online narrative on this story have proven ineffective. However, past charm offensives aimed at the Western mainstream media have not, and one doesn't have to scroll back too far to see the evidence of that. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS, effectively took power less than 18 months ago. His promises of reform, his decision to finally allow Saudi women to drive, along with a carefully choreographed media tour in the US, went down well.
Working hard?
A little bit.
News outlets that are usually skeptical of Saudi propaganda, including the BBC, The Guardian, The Washington Post, and The New York Times, bought in, producing positive stories and editorials. You can still find those articles online. Given what has happened since, and the changes that haven't happened, the editors who signed off on those pieces probably wish they could take them back.
You really have to believe that some of it was a willful ignorance. Thomas Friedman calling MBS the embodiment of Saudi Arabia's Arab Spring, deliberately ignoring the obvious violations of these principles in the arrests of journalists and the crackdown on women activists and other illiberal policies that MBS oversaw. And now we've seen some attempts by the likes of Thomas Friedman to backpedal and really being reluctant to, even now, take a strong stand against the Crown Prince.
It's clear that the Western press went overboard in promoting him as a positive force for change in the region. So the lesson of this is, don't fall for these propaganda campaigns when they're presented by Arab governments or any government. Demand facts, demand proof, and judge people on their actions, not just their nice words. And I think this is a lesson for journalists everywhere.
The disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi will resonate with journalists and all kinds of other voices, from activists to dissidents to would-be revolutionaries, and not just in the Middle East.
Khashoggi was not actually a threat to the government. He was a voice of reason, and the government should have welcomed voices like Khashoggi. He always spoke with respect about Saudi leaders. So if Khashoggi was a threat, then what to say about others?
It's about silencing voices, and this is not confined to Saudi Arabia. Authoritarian governments the world over, and even democratic countries as well, make these choices. The silencing of voices, the silencing of journalists seems to be a top priority for many governments around the world, well, from the US to Russia to the Arab world.
We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Flo Phillips. Flo, in Bulgaria, an investigative journalist has been found murdered. What can you tell us about the case of Victoria Marinova?
Richard, she worked for a small, popular private Bulgarian broadcaster, TVN. Her body was found last week in a park in the northeastern city of Ruse and reportedly showed evidence of rape. It's still unclear if the murder was linked to Marinova's journalistic work. We do know she was presenting a current affairs show called Detector, and in the first episode they had an interview with two Bulgarian reporters about their investigations into alleged fraud involving EU funds linked to businessmen and politicians.
And how have her colleagues at TVN reacted to this news?
Look, there's a lot of disbelief and confusion. One of her colleagues has said that we're in shock. In no way, under any form, never have we received any threats aimed at her or the television channel. He added that he and others at the network now really fear for their safety. In the past year, two other reporters, both known for their work on corruption, have been killed in the EU. Maltese journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia was killed by a car bomb exactly a year ago, while Slovak journalist Jan Kuciak and his fiancée were both shot dead in their home back in February.
Okay, moving on. It's been more than a year, but the Me Too movement has finally reached India, both the entertainment industry and the news industry. What kind of allegations have been made, and against whom?
This seems to have been sparked by women in the entertainment industry speaking out. There was an actress, Tanyashri Datta, who filed a police complaint, and a writer, Mahima Kukreja, whose story got loads of play on Twitter. And that really seems to have opened the floodgates. Numerous actors, authors, journalists, including some senior editors in the news industry, have since described instances of sexual harassment and assault. Now, I asked Bangalore-based journalist Sandhya Menon why it's taken so long for the Me Too movement to really take root in India.
I think the sense of shame is very, very, very large among Indian women. And I think it's taken a year because we're just trying to, over the year, just trying to screw up our guts, our courage to talk about it. 5 years ago, if I talked about my own cases, it would have been, the thought wouldn't have even crossed my mind that, you know, will they believe me, won't they believe me? I would have just taken it for granted I will not be believed, as it is with everywhere else, I suppose. That has sort of, I can't say disappeared, but there is hope that we will be believed. We've seen it all around us. Women are being believed and feminists are saying, we believe you. That's made a difference, to hear that I believe you.
And what have we been hearing from some of the media organizations caught up in these allegations?
Some media organizations say they've launched investigations. The question is, will they have an impact? And it's also important to note that all of this has been happening primarily in the English language media space. There are so many more outlets operating in Hindi and regional languages, but reporters there are yet to speak out.
Okay, thanks, Flo. Of all the industries disrupted, upended by the internet, the news business is right up there on the list. Newsrooms have shrunk, many papers have stopped printing since that ad space is no longer the valued commodity it once was. Responding to the new reality, many of the biggest names in news have started to sell a new kind of service based on their ability to connect with readers, to tell stories. And it's now available to corporate clients to burnish their image. It's the kind of content that a reader might see on that site anyway, even mistake for journalism, which is why this expanding industry is known as native advertising. In their own defense, news executives are stressing the separation of church, the editorial staff, and state, the business side. However, some big names in print have already blurred that boundary, and news consumers are understandably confused about content that got its start in business meetings rather than editorial ones. The Listening Post's Will Yong now on native advertising and the new business behind the news business.
The internet age has not been kind to newspapers. With the digital transition has come declining circulation, shrinking newsrooms, and many papers stopping their presses permanently. Fewer copies sold means advertisers are paying less to appear in print. No prizes for guessing where they want to be seen instead.
Google and Facebook now swallow up around 80% of all advertising money. Now, in a very short period of time, money which predominantly went to news publishers or to publishers in general, magazines, newspapers, whatever, now goes to the platforms. Against that background, news publishers started looking for a new way of sucking advertising back in. And what they said to advertisers was, why don't you let us design your ads for you?
So there's always been a relationship between industry, companies, PR firms, ad agencies, and reporters. So a lot of times reporters, they kind of get their tips and leads from companies and PR firms calling them up saying, hey, company X is launching this new product, we think it's great, and here's why, maybe you should write about it. However, native advertising is very different because a reporter can hang up on a public relations call, right? And he can say, no, I'm really not that interested. But what happens when the native advertising agency exists one floor above you? When both of you work at the same publication.
And it's happening all over the world. In-house creative teams consisting of journalists and marketers working together to produce so-called advertorial for brands and corporations. Back in 2016, an industry survey found that of the publishers in question, 35% considered native advertising to be very important for their business. Last year, that figure rose to 50%. And leading the way are some of the biggest names in journalism, such as the New York Times, whose T-brand studio produces what they call paid posts.
One of the early pieces we did that got quite a bit of acclaim was a 7-chapter interactive data visualization for Goldman Sachs, and that ran on our site for quite a while. The user comes to the Times to get immersed in, to pay great attention to really high-quality storytelling on topics that matter. And I think there's a benefit to a marketer for just being a part of that ecosystem.
Native schmative. An ad is an ad is an ad, is the way I feel about it. The New York Times should not be in the business of managing people's opinion of Goldman Sachs. There is no way that I can take as seriously the New York Times reporting on Goldman Sachs, knowing that they have just been on this content creation journey together. Native advertising is just an effort to confuse readers to think that they're getting something other than an ad.
Standard practice at the New York Times and other outlets is to label branded content so readers know when it's been paid for by a client. However, London's large circulation free newspaper, the Evening Standard, shows us where the lines between business and editorial can be blurred to the point of erasure. Back in May, an exposé by Open Democracy revealed that the Standard was offering not just branded content, but money-can't-buy positive news and favourable comment pieces that would appear to readers as journalism. When the story broke, the Standard quietly postponed the scheme. But last year, a likely 6-figure deal the Standard struck with Syngenta earned the agribusiness giant glowing reports, putting them at the heart of the future of food production. No reference to the controversies that dog the company, and not a mention of sponsorship in sight.
The Evening Standard in London started presenting to clients, suggesting that they would not only get advertorial produced for them by Evening Standard staff, but that this would lead to them getting better news coverage. Now, this led to real concern amongst Evening Standard staff, because what you're actually saying is we're going to hoodwink our audience so that our audience doesn't realise that you've paid us. and your name will just slip into the news coverage. This really does blur the line between what is permissible as advertising, as paid for content, and what is not.
Something that is never to be tampered with is the utter independence of our newsroom from the commercial interest of an individual advertiser. We had to create a group of people that were entirely separate from the newsroom operation of the New York Times. We would share the storytelling tools, but we would never share the storytellers.
To say that there's always been a sturdy wall between the business side of an organization and the editorial newsroom, that hasn't historically always been true. Now when you have these people on the business side that are former journalists pitching to real journalists in the newsroom, and they walk into the same building every day, and they both share the mission of the paper, right? Which these days is mostly to keep news alive and to make sure that you're reporting and you can keep the lights on.
In an era of anxiety about the future of news, native advertising is providing comfort. Journalists seem to be every bit as qualified as copywriters and creatives at generating the kind of content that corporations love, earning news outlets a share in the revenues that might otherwise have gone to ad agencies or PR companies. But while native advertising might keep journalism's heart pumping, some say the risk is that journalism is selling its soul.
Advertisers aren't stupid. When they pay money for something, they expect to get something in return. With native advertising, your ad seems to be a little bit more under the aegis of this respectable news organization. If it didn't work like an ad, they wouldn't pay for it like an ad. And that's the important thing to remember, whether it's called storytelling or content or co-branding, it still represents journalists making work using criteria that is something other than journalistic criteria.
I think the best way to maintain healthy, independent journalism is to maintain a healthy business model. Readers are seeing companies that are using the canvas of a Times article page to tell a story in the appropriate ways I've described before, creating feature-length productions for marketers that stand at the quality level where they can run on a place like the New York Times.
For the growing number of news outlets embracing native advertising, there may be no turning back. And yet its impact on audiences is still unclear. Studies find that consumers often confuse native ads with editorial content, and that when they discover what they've been reading is sponsored, their reaction is negative. While the debate over the need for industry regulation rages on, watch out for partnered content, paid programs, content that is brought to you by, in association with, co-created with, or hosted by. The list goes on.
It's really hard for a reader to understand what does created by mean, what does powered by mean. When you start to kind of track how these labels have changed over time, what it really tells you is that they're trying to push boundaries. More and more content that you're going to see on a news publisher site is going to be funded by some kind of brand. And I think that long term, we're going to have to deal with the effect of like, what is hard news anymore?
And finally, this month marks the first anniversary of the Me Too movement. Plenty of people are weighing in on Twitter, although few would have expected the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, to be one of them. His account features a video proposing a solution for the issue of sexual harassment and assaults on Western women. That is, for women to wear the hijab, the Islamic headscarf. Not that Khamenei or the government in Tehran are in much of a position to lecture anybody on this. Getting data on the frequency of sexual harassment cases in Iran is not easy. However, a recent study conducted in the province of Mazandaran revealed that 95% of women there have such stories to tell. That's 19 out of 20. Khamenei might want to focus a little closer to home, rather than sending messages like the following video to distant Western audiences. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
شنیدید که تعداد قابل توجهی از بانوان صاحب مقام غربی
Yes, I have a Me Too story too.
یکی پس از دیگری اعلان کردند که در دوران جوانی در جریان مسائل اداری که در اونجاها عضو بودن مورد سوء استفاده قرار گرفتن با زور با خشونت.
Let me tell you about this guy Trump and the experience I had with him.
این رو به زبان آوردن گفتن اینا زنهای معمولی نیستن، زنهای برجسته‌اند، زنهای برجسته غربی. اسلام در رو بر روی اون مسیری که جنس زن را به این نقطه انحراف برسانه در رو بسته، اجازه نداده به وسیله حجاب.